The whole of the county had come to Oakhaven Manor that evening, and every last one of them believed they were about to watch a love story. That was the thing spoken of in the carriages along the long gravel drive, whispered behind painted fans as the guests filed into the great hall. Duke Raymond of Oakhaven adored his wife. Everyone knew it. He had married Eleanor when lesser men had turned their eyes from her, married her gladly, and in the 3 years since he had never once looked at another woman. So when the invitations arrived for the autumn ball, the ladies of the Tuns sighed over their embroidery and told one another it would be a night to remember. They were right, though not in the way a single one of them imagined. Duchess Eleanor sat near the tall windows at the eastern end of the ballroom, where the light of 100 beeswax tapers fell soft upon her. Her gown was deep sapphire silk, the sleeves trimmed in silver thread, and her dark hair had been dressed in careful curls that framed a face too kind to be called merely beautiful. Her chair was of dark mahogany, its wheels turned by a craftsman in London who had built it to her exact measure. She had never thought of the chair as a cage. She had learned long ago that a life could be lived seated as easily as standing, provided there was love enough in it. And she had love, or so she had believed until that night. The orchestra struck up a minuet. Eleanor's gloved fingers tapped gently against the arm of her chair, keeping time, while her eyes stayed fixed upon the great doors. Raymond had been strange these past weeks. Quiet at supper, awake at odd hours, his study door bolted against her. Once she had asked whether some trouble weighed on him, and he had only pressed a kiss to her brow and told her all was well. A wife chose to believe such things. She had chosen. The doors opened. Raymond came through them, and for one bright moment Eleanor's heart rose, for he was the handsomest man in any room he entered. Tall, broad through the shoulder, his dark evening coat cut close, and a single sapphire pinned at his throat to match her gown. He had chosen it to match her gown. She was certain of it. Then she saw the woman on his arm. The stranger was clad in crimson so bold it seemed to burn against the pale marble floor. Her gloved hand rested upon Raymond's sleeve, as though it had every right in the world to be there. The orchestra faltered. Conversations died half-spoken. 200 faces turned toward the doors, and then, as one, 200 pairs of eyes slid to the Duchess by the window. Raymond did not look at his wife. He walked the length of the ballroom with the woman in red, past the long tables of glazed fruit and iced almond cakes, past the earls and their ladies and the bishop's daughters, and he smiled at his companion, as though Eleanor were not present at all. When old Lady Ashcombe, scandalized past bearing, murmured his name and gestured plainly toward the Duchess, Raymond turned his head and let his gaze pass over his wife, the way a man's gaze passes over a curtain or an empty chair, something unseen, something that did not matter. "My dear Duke," Lady Ashcombe said, her voice trembling, "will you not greet the Duchess?" "The Duchess," Raymond answered, cool as riverstone, "may greet herself." A gasp went round the room like wind through a field of wheat. Somewhere, a young man laughed, high and nervous, and was quickly hushed by the lady beside him. And the woman in crimson smiled and pressed closer to the Duke's side, and the whole glittering company held its breath to see what the crippled wife would do. Eleanor sat very still. She knew the taste of humiliation. She had swallowed it before, in the years when strangers stared and matchmaking mothers steered their sons a wide path around her chair. She knew the cold iron taste of it well, but never from him, never from Raymond, who had once carried her up the manor stairs in his own arms, because he could not bear to wait upon the footman, who wrote her name in the frost of the morning windows each winter. She searched his face now for the man she had married, and she could not find him. His jaw was set hard as marble. His eyes were fixed upon the far wall, above the heads of the crowd, upon nothing at all. Yet there was one thing. and she would remember it long afterward, when it came to mean more than anything else in the world. His free hand, the one the stranger did not hold, was clenched so fiercely at his side that the seam of his white glove had split clean along the knuckle. She did not understand it. She understood only that the whole county was watching her heart break, and that she would sooner die than grant them the sight of her tears. "Bring me my shawl," she said quietly to the young footman at her shoulder. His eyes were wet. "Your Grace, my shawl, John." And then the door. He fetched it. Her own hands did not shake as she drew the silver-gray wool about her shoulders, though something deep within her had gone very cold and very quiet. She set her palms to the wheels of her chair and turned them herself, refusing every offered hand, and the crowd parted before her in a hush so complete that she could hear the candles hiss in their sconces. At the threshold she paused. Every instinct in her begged her to look back, to catch some sign that this was not real, that her husband would come to his senses and cross that vast cold floor to reach her. She did not turn. Her pride was the last garment left to her that night, and she wore it to the very end. Behind her, the Duke ordered the orchestra to play on. The music trailed after her down the corridor, thin and false, as her chair rolled over the marble toward the private wing. What Eleanor did not see, what no soul in that dazzling ballroom saw, was the single glance the Duke stole the instant her back was turned. A look so heavy with grief that, had any living person caught it, they would have known at once that this cruel performance was not at all the thing it seemed. But no one caught it, and the tall doors closed behind the Duchess of Oakhaven. The great house had emptied by midnight. The carriages of the ton rolled away one by one down the gravel drive, their lamps swallowed whole by the autumn fog, until at last only the servants and the silence remained. In her private chambers on the western side of the manor, Duchess Eleanor sat alone before the dying fire and did not weep. She had done her weeping in the corridor, quietly, where none could witness it. What remained in her now was a stillness that frightened even herself. Upon the writing desk beneath the window lay a folded document she had not placed there. Cream paper, its seal already broken, the ink upon it still fresh. She had found it waiting when Agnes wheeled her back into the room, set out with such care that it seemed almost to have been arranged to be discovered. A deed of separation. Her own name written in a clerk's neat hand upon one line, and below it a space left empty for a second. Raymond's signature was already there. Eleanor read it 3 times by the small light of the candle. He had signed it that very afternoon, for the date sat plainly beneath his name. So the whole cruel evening had been prepared beforehand, down to its last insult, and this paper had lain in waiting before ever she was wheeled into the ballroom. Something inside her closed like a shutter against a coming storm. A soft knock came, and Agnes slipped through the door without waiting for leave. The maid was a slight woman of some 40 years, her cap gone crooked, her eyes rimmed red from her own tears. She had served Eleanor since the Duchess was a girl in her father's house, and she loved her the fierce, wordless way that servants sometimes come to love those they have helped to raise. "You'll not sign it," Agnes said. It was half a plea and half a command. "I have already decided. Your Grace, he is not himself. A good man does not turn cruel in a single season without some cause behind it. Wait for the morning. Speak with him. I have tried to speak with him for a month." Eleanor's voice stayed level, which was worse, somehow, than if it had shattered. "He has bolted every door between us. Tonight he gave his answer, before the whole of the county. I'll not remain where I am so plainly unwanted. I would sooner keep the little dignity that is left me." She dipped the pen. Her hand was steady as she wrote her name beneath his, and when it was done she pressed the blotting sand upon the wet ink and folded the paper closed. So ended 3 years of marriage, in the small scratch of a nib. "We leave within the hour," she said, "before the household stirs and turns it into a spectacle. Pack only what is truly mine, the plain gowns, my mother's letters, the little portrait of Papa. Leave every jewel he ever gave me. I will carry nothing of his out of this house." Agnes worked swiftly, folding linen and wool into a modest traveling case by candlelight, while the tall wardrobes of silk and satin stood untouched. As the maid reached for a carpet-bag, Eleanor's gaze fell upon a great old traveling trunk against the far wall, banded in worn brass, its leather cracked and pale with age. "Not that one," Eleanor said. "That is Oakhaven property. It stays. But His Grace sent it up himself this very morning." Agnes frowned at the memory, carried it on his own shoulder. "He did, and gave the strictest word that it was to travel with you wherever you should go." The under-butler thought he'd taken leave of his senses. Eleanor stared at the battered thing. Of all the day's cruelties, this small kindness made the least sense of any. Why should a man cast out his wife with one hand and press an old trunk upon her with the other? She had no strength left in her to puzzle at it. "Very well," she murmured. "Bring it then. I've no wish to quarrel with the man's whims tonight." She would remember those careless words for the rest of her life. The manor slept as they made their slow way down through the servants' passage, Agnes bearing the candle and steadying the chair over the ramped boards that Raymond had ordered laid throughout the house in the first year of their marriage, so that his wife might go wherever she pleased within its walls. Eleanor would not let herself think on that now. A carriage waited in the courtyard below, a plain hired thing with 2 weary horses, arranged in secret by the loyal head groom, and bearing no crest upon its door. 2 footmen lifted her gently to the seat, then folded the mahogany chair and lashed it fast behind. The old trunk was heaved up and roped alongside it. Fog lay thick and cold across the cobbles, and within it the carriage lamps burned small and gold. "Where will you go, Your Grace?" the groom asked, his voice low. "Home," Eleanor said, "to Zephyr Valley, to the one house that was ever truly mine." The whip cracked softly. The wheels began to turn over the wet stone, and Oakhaven Manor, its 100 bright windows gone dark, its ballroom cold, its master lost to her, slid away into the mist behind her. She did not look up. Had she raised her eyes but once to the high balcony above the courtyard, she would have seen him. Raymond stood there in his shirt sleeves against the biting cold, both hands gripping the stone rail so hard that his arms trembled, watching the small carriage carry his wife away from him. The proud mask he had worn through the whole long evening was gone from his face. In the faint lamplight, he had the look of a man drowning within sight of the shore, and the tears ran freely down his cheeks and were not wiped away, for there was no one left below him to deceive. He watched until the fog closed over the last dim glow of the carriage lamps, and then a little longer, as though he might yet call it back by wanting it enough. When even the sound of the wheels had faded into the night, he bowed his head against the wet stone and let out a low, broken sound that no Duke of Oakhaven should ever have made. Far below, knowing none of it, Eleanor rode on into the dark. Her hands lay folded in her lap, and her chin was lifted, and roped to the side of the humble carriage traveled a battered old trunk, whose secret, in the fullness of time, would come to unmake every lie that had ever been told that day. 30 miles east of Oakhaven, where the moorland gave way to a bleak and joyless town, there stood a building the local people crossed the road to avoid. They called it the Obsidian Citadel, though it had begun its life humbly enough as a wool merchant's counting house. Its present master had since faced the whole of it in black stone, quarried at great expense, until the grim building seemed to drink in the morning light rather than give any of it back. Behind those walls sat Lord Malachor, and there was scarcely a cargo, a warehouse, or a trade road for 40 miles that did not, in some hidden fashion, belonged to him. Raymond arrived a little after 9, alone, having dismissed his coachman at the gate. He would let no servant witness what passed within. A silent clerk led him up a winding stair of black iron and left him before a great studded door. Beyond it lay a long room paneled in dark wood, chill in spite of the fire roaring in its enormous grate, and hung with maps upon which whole valleys and villages had been marked out and claimed in red ink. At the far end, behind a desk broad as a dining table, sat the man himself. Lord Malachor was neither tall nor fearsome to look upon. He was a soft, round-shouldered figure in a suit of costly slate, his fingers heavy with rings, his face pale and mild as milk. Only the eyes betrayed him. They were small and patient, and wholly without warmth, the eyes of a man who had never once been told the word no, and did not expect to hear it now. Upon a couch beside the fire, still draped in the crimson she had worn the evening before, lounged the very woman who had walked into the Oakhaven ballroom upon the Duke's arm. "Your Grace?" Malachor did not rise. "You look wearied. I trust the evening unfolded as we agreed." Raymond's jaw hardened. "It is done. The whole county saw what you wished them to see. My wife has left me. You have your spectacle. I have the beginning of it." Malachor folded his soft hands. "Vespera tells me you played your part beautifully. Most convincing, she says. One might almost have supposed you meant every word." The woman in red smiled without lifting her gaze from the flames. "He wept afterward," she remarked idly. "Out on the balcony, I watched him through the glass." "Did he indeed?" Malachor's mild eyes settled upon the Duke. How very tender of him. Raymond crossed the room in 3 long strides and set both hands upon the desk. "I have shamed the woman I love before every soul of standing in this county. I have signed her out of my own life. Now tell me plainly what more you require, and let us have an end of it. Sit, your Grace. Fury spoils the digestion." Malachor waited until Raymond, with visible effort, lowered himself into the chair. "You know perfectly well what I require. I have wanted it since the day you wed that girl and bound your fortune to hers. But let me set it before you once more, so nothing lies unclear between us." He drew a leather folder from a drawer and opened it wide. Within lay documents thick with seals and signatures, and upon the topmost sheet a name Raymond knew as well as his own: Zephyr Valley. "Her people have farmed that valley for 200 years, Malachor said pleasantly. "Her grandfather raised the mill upon its river. Every cottage, every field, every stone of that little gray church, and the deed to each acre of it now rests within this folder. I bought up the old mortgages quietly, across a great many years, through names that lead nowhere near my own. The good folk of Zephyr Valley have no notion of it yet, but they draw every breath at my pleasure." Raymond made no answer. He had heard the whole of it a month past, in this same joyless room. Hearing it again made it no lighter to bear. "Defy me," Malachor continued, "and I shall call in every debt at once. The mill comes down for its timber. The farms are cleared for grazing that pays me better than any grain. Her aunts, her cousins, the aged, all turned out upon the road before the winter is fairly begun. And your cherished Eleanor would understand, to the last day of her life, that it was her marriage to you that carried the ruin to their doors." "You are a coward," Raymond said quietly, "to make war upon farming folk because one duke will not bend his knee to you. I make war upon no one. I am a man of commerce, and commerce keeps no heart to be wounded." Malachor shut the folder with a soft snap. "You might have spared them all of this. I asked one thing only, that you set your wife aside and sign over those trade monopolies your family has hoarded for 3 generations. The wool routes, the harbor rights, the tolls upon the eastern road. Grant me those, and Zephyr Valley may go on dreaming itself free. Refuse, and I will grind it into the dirt. The choice, your grace, remains entirely your own." Raymond stared at the maps upon the wall, at the red ink spreading across them like a slow stain. He had turned this trap over in his mind through 100 sleepless nights, hunting the seam in it, the flaw, the clever way out. There was none to be found. The law was the law, and Malachor had bought it fairly. Should Raymond fight in the open, Eleanor's family would be destroyed, and she dragged through the courts at his side. The one shelter he could raise over her was distance. She had to be cast out and disgraced, set as far from his coming ruin as a man could put her, hating him if that was the price of it, so long as she stayed beyond harm's reach. "Bring me the signed monopolies within the month," Malachor said, "and we shall count the matter settled. And do spare yourself the trouble of hunting through the record offices for some ancient charter to unseat my claim. Sharper men than you have searched for a flaw in my deeds and come away with nothing. What I hold forever." Raymond rose. At the door he paused and looked back at the woman in red, who had watched the whole exchange with the mild curiosity of one observing rain against a window. "You will answer for this," he told her. "Both of you. In time." Malachor only smiled and drew his ledgers toward him as a man turns back to pleasant work. Raymond stepped out into the bleak morning air and drew the first free breath he had managed in an hour. He had purchased his wife's safety with her love, the poorest bargain of his life, and he would have struck it again 1,000 times over if it kept her from harm. Yet even the sturdiest shield can wound the hand that lifts it, and the ruin Malachor had promised him was already stirring, far closer to home than either man in that black room could have guessed, within the cold and emptied halls of Oakhaven itself. Word of the Duchess's departure ran through Oakhaven Manor before the breakfast trays had been cleared. There were more than 40 souls in service beneath that great roof, cooks and scullery maids, grooms and gardeners, footmen and laundresses, and not one among them was without some quiet debt of kindness to Eleanor. Mrs. Pruitt, who had ruled the kitchens for 20 years, remembered the winter her boy took a fever, and how the Duchess had sent her own physician down to the servants' quarters and sat up 2 nights herself. The old head gardener remembered the low bench she had ordered built beside the rose walk, that a man with an aching hip might rest a while without shame. Each of them carried some such memory, for the Duchess had known every one of them by name, and the names of their children besides, and she had never once passed a servant on the stair without a word of greeting. Now she was gone, turned out like a stranger, and in her place walked a woman in red, who did not trouble to learn a single name. Vespera had arrived that same morning in one of the Duke's own coaches, and she moved through the rooms as though born to them. She rang the bells at all hours. She ordered fires lit in chambers she never entered, and left them burning to waste. By noon she had summoned Mr. Grayling, the head butler, and demanded that the Duchess's own chambers be stripped and made ready for her use. Mr. Grayling was a tall, spare man of 60, who had served 3 generations of Oakhavens and had never once in his life been known to raise his voice. He bowed, very correctly. "I regret, madam, that it cannot be done." "Cannot?" Vespera laughed. "You forget yourself. Your master has made his wishes plain. I am mistress here now." "You are a guest here, madam." Grayling's tone was as smooth and cool as polished glass. "And I find, upon reflection, that I am no longer in service to this house." He drew off his white gloves and set them upon the hall table. Beside them he laid the great ring of household keys, worn bright by 40 years of his own hand. Then he walked out through the tall doors he had opened for dukes and duchesses since before Raymond was born, and he did not look back. By 2 o'clock the kitchens had fallen silent. Mrs. Pruitt banked the great range for the last time, hung her apron upon its peg, and led her scullery maids out through the yard without a word between them. The fires beneath the ovens, sank to gray ash. In the stables, the head groom, a broad, quiet man named Ned Carter, who had steadied the Duchess into her carriage only 3 nights before, opened every stall and led the horses out into the paddock, so that no innocent beast, at least, should suffer for what the master had done. The footmen shed their livery and folded it neatly upon the servants' benches. The laundresses left the linen soaking in the coppers and untied their aprons. One by one, and then in 2s and 3s, the whole household of Oakhaven took up its bundles and walked down the long drive toward the village, and not a soul among them spoke so much as a hard word as they went. That was the strange power of it. No shouting rose, no crockery was smashed, nothing at all was stolen. There was only a quiet, unbending refusal to keep a house that had so wronged the one person in it worth the keeping. Vespera stood upon the front steps and watched them go, and for the first time her composure cracked. She called after the butler by name. She threatened the cook with the magistrate. She promised the footmen wages at twice what the Duke had ever paid them. Not a single head turned upon the drive. She was learning what any of them could have told her, that a great house is not its stone and its plate and its fine French furniture, but the living people who keep it breathing. Every last one of them had loved the woman she had helped to cast out, and now every last one of them was gone. By evening she was alone in it. The change fell upon Oakhaven with a speed that was almost frightening. Left without hands to tend it, the manor seemed to age 100 years in a single afternoon. The hearths went dark and would not be coaxed alight, for Vespera had never in her life laid a fire. A gray film of dust began to settle upon the long tables, where the ball had been held only nights before. The candles guttered low and were not replaced, so that the great corridors sank into an early gloom. Somewhere in the west wing, a window had been left unlatched, and a raw autumn wind wandered through the empty rooms, lifting the corners of the dust sheets that no hand would ever now draw off. The tall clock in the hall wound slowly down and stopped at 20 minutes past 4, and there was no one left who thought to set it going again. Before nightfall, the grandest house in all the county stood chill and dim and quiet as a tomb, and the woman in red sat alone at the vast dining table with a plate of bread and cheese she had been obliged to fetch for herself, listening to the wind find its way through the rooms. It was near midnight when Raymond returned from the east, weary to the marrow, his mind still black with the weight of Malacor's bargain. He drew up before his own door and found no groom to take the reins, no footman waiting with a lamp, no butler to swing the doors wide before him. The windows of Oakhaven, which had blazed with warm light every night of his living memory, stood dark from cellar to attic. He let himself in through his own front door, like a common housebreaker, and his boots rang loud upon the bare stone of an empty hall. He understood it then, standing in the cold and the dark of the house his family had held for 300 years. He understood at last what Eleanor had been to the place. She had been its warmth and its light and its beating heart, and he had driven her from it with his own 2 hands. The estate had not fallen because Lord Malacor had willed its fall. It had fallen because the soul had simply gone out of it and walked away down the drive and would not come back. Raymond lowered himself onto the bottom step of the great staircase, alone in the ruin of his own making, and for a long while the only sound in all of Oakhaven was the wind moving through the empty rooms above him, and the slow, cold silence of a clock that had stopped. The road into Zephyr Valley wound down through low green hills, and the moment the carriage crested the last of them, Eleanor felt something in her chest begin, very slowly, to unclench. She had not seen the valley since she was a girl, yet it seemed not to have changed at all. The little river ran bright over its stones as it always had. The old mill wheel her grandfather built still turned upon the water. Apple orchards climbed the slopes in careful rows, heavy with the last fruit of autumn, and from every cottage chimney rose a thin ribbon of wood smoke into the pale afternoon sky. Word of her coming had traveled ahead, and half the village had gathered at the crossroads to meet her. Old women who had known her mother, farmers who had carried her upon their shoulders when she was small, a gaggle of shy children clutching posies of late Michaelmas daisies. Not one of them cared that she came home a cast-off wife in a hired carriage. To Zephyr Valley she was simply their own, come back to them at last. They had made ready the small stone cottage at the orchard's edge, the very house in which her mother had been born. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate. Fresh rushes lay upon the floor, and warm bread waited on the table beside a jug of new milk. After the vast cold splendor of the manor she had left behind, that low-beamed little parlor with its single square window seemed to Eleanor the most welcome place in all the wide world. Agnes wheeled her chair across the threshold, and the two of them wept a little, and then they set about the quiet business of making a life. For 2 days, Eleanor did her best to be content. She sat in the sun beside the door, while the village came and went, with small gifts and smaller kindnesses. She told herself the ache would dull in time, as all aches do. She did not speak of Raymond, and Agnes was wise enough never to ask. On the 3rd day they came at last to the trunks. Agnes had left the great battered traveling trunk until the very end, for it was the heaviest of all their baggage, and neither woman had the least notion what it held. The Duke had packed it with his own hands, that much they knew. When they turned the key and raised the lid, they found it filled with the plainest of things: folded blankets, a few of Eleanor's older gowns, the small painted miniature of her father, a bundle of her mother's letters, bound with faded ribbon. Nothing of any value, nothing to explain why a duke should carry such a thing up on his own shoulder and press it upon her with so strange an insistence. It was Agnes who found the truth of it. As she lifted the last blanket from the bottom, her knuckles rapped against the base, and the sound that answered was hollow. She frowned and pressed and ran her fingers along the worn leather lining until they caught upon a small brass catch tucked deep in the corner. It gave with a soft click. A false floor, no thicker than a book, lifted cleanly away, and beneath it lay a single object wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor drew it into her lap with unsteady hands and unwound the cloth. Within lay a slim volume bound in dark green leather, its pages soft with much handling, and she knew it upon the instant. It was Raymond's private journal, the very book she had watched him bend over on so many locked and silent nights, the book he had never once permitted her to open. For a long while she could not bring herself to look inside it. Then she did. The earliest entries were of no consequence. The ordinary business of an estate, a note on the harvest, a line about the weather turning. But as she turned the pages, the hand grew hurried, and the ink was pressed hard into the paper, uneven, and the words upon it began to break her heart. "I have found no way out of it," he had written. "I have been to every record office in the county, and there is no flaw anywhere in the man's claim upon her valley. If I refuse him, her people lose all they have before the winter is out. If I fight him in the open, she is dragged down into the ruin at my side. There is but one road left to me, and it is the cruelest thing I shall ever be called upon to do." She turned the page. The next entry was dated the very morning of the ball. "Tonight I must break her heart in order to keep her whole. I must make her despise me, for only if she despises me will she consent to leave, and only if she leaves will she be safe and far from what is coming. God forgive me for it. She will believe I never loved her. She may go to her grave believing it. That is the price of her safety, and I shall pay it gladly, for I would sooner she live her life hating me than lose it loving me." The book slid from her fingers to the floor. All of it came back to her at once and turned itself entirely inside out. The separation papers that had waited on her desk before ever the ball began, he had made ready her escape, and not her disgrace. The battered trunk pressed upon her with such peculiar urgency, he had hidden the whole truth within it, where he trusted that one day she alone would think to look. The split seam of his glove, the fist clenched white at his side, the coldness in his manner that had never once climbed as high as his eyes. He had not stopped loving her. He had never faltered for a single breath. He had stood before the entire county and torn the heart out of his own chest to raise a wall between his wife and a danger she had not even known enough to fear. Agnes was weeping freely now, but Eleanor found she could not. Something fiercer than grief was rising in her, clear and bright, and burning the sorrow clean away. She thought again of the despairing words in the journal. No flaw in the man's claim. Every record office searched to no purpose. Raymond had looked in all the places a duke would think to look, but he was no son of Zephyr Valley, and she was its daughter. She had been raised on the old tale of the ancient charter, the grant that had given the valley into her family's keeping, generations before any merchant's mortgage was ever dreamed of. If such a paper yet survived, it would lie in no public office in any town. It would be here, among the very things her people had guarded and handed down for 200 years. She looked to the small locked chest of family papers that Agnes had carried down beside the trunk. He believed there was no way out, Eleanor said softly, and for the first time since the night of the ball, there was steel beneath her voice. He was wrong, and I intend to prove it. The high mercantile bank of Solitude stood at the very heart of the town, a great pillared hall of pale stone, where the fortunes of half the county were weighed, lent, and lost. Beneath its high vaulted ceiling, rows of clerks bent low over their ledgers, and the air hung thick with the smell of ink and sealing wax, and the endless dry scratching of 100 pens. It was here, on a raw gray morning 8 days after the ball, that Raymond came to learn the true price of the bargain he had struck. He had always known it would be steep. He had never guessed how bottomless a pit Lord Malachor had dug beneath his feet. A clerk showed him into a private room above the great hall, where 3 grave men of business sat behind a long table strewn with papers. Malachor stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing down upon the street as a man surveys land he already owns. "Your Grace," said the eldest of the bankers, a thin fellow with spectacles perched low upon his nose, "I fear the news is far from good. Your estate's accounts have gone unsettled this quarter. The wool never went to market, the rents were never gathered in. Your household stands empty, and your creditors have grown most uneasy." "They have grown uneasy," Malachor said mildly, turning from the window, "because I have made them so." He drew a thick sheaf of documents from beneath his arm and laid it upon the table with the care of a man setting down a winning hand at cards. "These are your debts, Your Grace. Every promissory note your family has put its name to these 20 years. I have spent a small fortune quietly buying them up, one by one, from every merchant and moneylender between here and the coast. They are mine now, all of them, and I find that I should very much like to be repaid, at once, in full." Raymond looked at the pile of paper, and the room seemed to tilt a little beneath him. "You know I cannot pay them all at once. I know it perfectly." Malachor smiled his soft, patient smile. "No man alive could, which is exactly why I took such pains to gather them." "We had an agreement." Raymond's voice dropped very low. "I set my wife aside. I disgraced myself before the whole of the county. In return, you were to spare Zephyr Valley and leave my house standing. You agreed to sign me your trade monopolies," Malachor corrected gently. "I never once spoke a word about leaving your house standing. A monopoly is a fine thing, Your Grace, but why be content with the milk when with a little patience one may have the whole cow?" He spread his soft ringed hands. Your estate, your title, your lands, your ancient name, every last part of it shall pass to me before the month is out, and quite lawfully too. You gave up your wife for nothing at all. That, I confess, is the part of the business I find most diverting. Something cold and terrible moved through Raymond, though he did not permit it to reach his face. He had surrendered the one soul in the world he loved to a man who had never meant to keep his half of the bargain. Every cruelty of that dreadful night had been wasted upon empty air. Yet even as ruin closed over his head, one small comfort remained, and he held to it as a drowning man holds to a floating spar. Eleanor was gone. Eleanor was safe in Zephyr Valley, far from this cold room and these grasping hands, and whatever Malachor stripped from him now, he could not reach her there. Take it then, Raymond said quietly. Take the house and the lands and the title. Take the whole of it. You will never take her, and she was the one thing you wanted most. Malachor's smile held, but something behind the mild eyes cooled by a degree. He had no love for the truth of it. The door opened then, and Vespera swept in, dressed for the road in a fine traveling mantle of dove gray, a bandbox tucked beneath her arm. I heard the news below stairs, she said, to no one in particular. The great Duke of Oakhaven, ruined at last. What a pity. She turned to Malachor with the ease of long acquaintance. I take it my little part in this play is finished? Quite finished, Malachor answered. You have earned your fee. Then I shall catch the noon coach. She granted Raymond a single glance, cool and wholly incurious, the sort of glance one gives a chair one no longer has any use for. You ought to have offered me more than he did, Your Grace. I might have played a very different part. Still, there are no hard feelings between us. A woman must go where the money lies, and the money, I'm afraid, is quite finished with you. She was gone before Raymond could summon a single word worth spending upon her. He heard her light step upon the stair, and the closing of the great doors below, and after that, nothing at all. The eldest banker cleared his throat and slid one final document across the table. There remains only the matter of the formal seizure, Your Grace. Lord Malachor has petitioned the Court of Arbitrators in the city of Aethelgard to have your estates and titles lawfully transferred into his name. The hearing is set for the day after tomorrow. You would be wise to attend, though I shall not pretend there is a great deal you might do to prevent the outcome. Raymond took up the paper and read the clerk's cold, careful hand without truly seeing a word of it. 2 days. In 2 days he would stand in an open court and watch 300 years of his family's name signed away to a merchant who had cheated him even in the very hour of his surrender. He rose and bowed to the 3 grave men with all the dignity that was left to him and walked out through the vast echoing hall, alone, past the long rows of clerks who never once lifted their heads. He stepped into the gray morning air and drew his coat close against the chill of it. He did not weep. He had spent the last of his tears a week before upon a cold balcony and had none remaining to give. He had lost his fortune, his house, and his name, and within 2 short days he would lose the last shreds of all 3 before a public court. One comfort only was left to him, and he clung to it as a man clings to the final coin in an empty purse. That Eleanor was far away in her green valley, safe and quiet, beyond the reach of every part of this. It did not once occur to him that she might have no intention of staying there. The Grand Court of Arbitrators stood in the old quarter of Aethelgard, a solemn chamber of dark oak and high leaded windows, where disputes too great for any single magistrate were weighed by a panel of learned and impartial men. On the 9th day, a little after noon, that chamber was packed to its very walls, for word had run through the whole city that the Duke of Oakhaven was to be stripped of all he owned, and the public benches groaned with the curious. Raymond sat alone at the petitioner's table, straight-backed and silent in a plain, dark coat. Across the floor from him, Lord Malachor reclined at his ease behind a mountain of documents, a small and satisfied smile playing about his soft mouth. The chief arbitrator, a gray-bearded gentleman named Sir Edmund Thorne, had heard the whole of the matter out through the morning. He turned the last of Malachor's deeds over in his hands and set it down with a weary air. "The documents appear to be in good order," he said heavily. "Lord Malachor holds the debts, and the debts stand unanswered. My Lord Duke, unless you can show this court some cause we have not yet heard, I can see no course open to us but to grant the petition and to pass the estates and titles of Oakhaven into Lord Malachor's keeping." "I have no cause to offer," Raymond answered. His voice was low, but it did not waver. "I shall not insult this court with excuses. Do what the law requires of you." Malachor inclined his head, gracious in the very hour of his triumph. Sir Edmund lifted his pen. The great doors at the rear of the chamber flew open with a crash that rang from wall to wall. Every head turned as one. A broad shaft of afternoon light poured through the open doorway, and into it rolled a mahogany chair, its wheels turning steadily over the old stone floor, pushed by a plainly dressed maidservant and flanked upon either side by 3 sober men in the black gowns of scholars of law. In the chair, her head unbowed and her dark eyes alight, sat the Duchess of Oakhaven. "You will hold your pen, Sir Edmund," Eleanor said, and though she did not raise her voice, it reached every corner of the hushed room. "This court has not yet heard the whole of the matter." "Not by half." Raymond came to his feet, as though hauled up by a string, and every trace of color left his face. He had built his every choice, and paid every dreadful price, upon the one certainty that she was safe and far away in her valley. To see her here, rolling into the very heart of the danger he had ruined himself to keep her from, struck him dumb with terror, and with a wild, unlooked-for hope. Malachor had risen too, and the easy smile had fallen away. "This is most irregular," he said sharply. "The lady is party to nothing in this room. She has no standing here whatever. I must ask that she be removed." "The lady," said the eldest of the black-gowned scholars, stepping forward, "has every standing in the world, my lord, as you shall very shortly see. I am Master Aldous Finch, of the Zephyr Valley College of Law, and my colleagues and I have traveled 2 days and 2 nights to lay a single document before this court, with the chief arbitrator's leave." Sir Edmund had set down his pen and was watching the newcomers with keen interest. He waved a hand. "The court will hear it. Approach." Eleanor set her hands to the wheels and rolled herself forward to the very foot of the arbitrator's bench. From a flat leather case upon her lap, she drew out a single sheet of parchment, ancient and brown along its edges, its ink faded, but its great wax seal, yet whole and unbroken. She raised it up for the whole court to see. "For 8 nights," she said, "I searched among the papers my family has kept and guarded for 200 years, since long before ever I was born. And at the bottom of an old chest, I found this. It is the original grant of Zephyr Valley, made over into my family's keeping generations ago, and sealed under a hand that no man in this room would dare to dispute." She passed it up to Sir Edmund, who received it with great care and bent his spectacles close above the faded lines. "Read it aloud if you would, Master Finch," Eleanor said. "Read the court, the clause that Lord Malachor has prayed all these years no living soul would ever find." Master Finch took up the parchment and read out in a clear, carrying voice. The old words were plain enough beneath their curling script. The valley had been granted into Eleanor's family under a strict and binding condition, that the land could never be sold, never be pledged, never be mortgaged, nor signed away by any hand at all, but must pass only ever by inheritance, from parent to child, down all the generations, for so long as the family should endure. A murmur rose through the chamber and swelled swiftly into open uproar. "Do you take my meaning, my lord?" Master Finch turned upon Malachor, and his mild scholar's face had gone stern and unyielding. "Every mortgage you so patiently gathered up across these many years was drawn upon land that could not lawfully be mortgaged at all. The men who put their names to those papers had no more right to pledge that valley than they had to pledge the moon in the sky. Your deeds are not merely weak, my lord. They are worth no more than the ink that stains them. You have raised your entire tower of threats upon a foundation of sand." Malachor's pale face had gone paler still. "That parchment is a forgery," he said, but the old certainty had cracked clean through his voice. "A clever fraud, dredged up to rescue a ruined man. I demand that it be examined." "It shall be examined most thoroughly, my lord. Upon that you have my word," said Sir Edmund, and there was iron now beneath his weary manner. "And should it prove as genuine as it appears to my eye, this court will have a great many questions to put to you, not least how a man comes to threaten a duke and demand his lands and title upon the strength of deeds that were never worth a single farthing." Across the crowded floor, through all the rising clamor of the room, Eleanor's eyes found Raymond's at last. He was gazing at her as a man gazes upon the impossible, at the wife he had betrayed in order to save, who had seen straight through his cruelty to the love beneath it, and had crossed 2 hard days of road to place herself squarely between him and his ruin. In her steady look, he read the whole of the truth she had no need to speak aloud. She knew everything. She had already forgiven whatever there was to forgive, and she had not come all this way to save the valley alone. She had come to save him. Sir Edmund Thorne called a recess of 1 hour, and within that single hour, the fate of 2 men was settled for good. The 3 scholars of Zephyr Valley bent over the ancient parchment at a side table alongside the court's own clerks, comparing its seal against the great registers of old grants, testing the age of the ink and the shape of the hand that had written it. The public benches did not empty. No soul dared step out for fear of missing the end of it. Malachor sat apart, his rings turning round and round upon his fingers, and for the first time in many long years, his soft, patient face wore the look of a man no longer certain of anything at all. When the court was called back to order, the light through the tall windows had deepened to the rich gold of late afternoon. Sir Edmund took his seat, the parchment laid open before him. "The court has satisfied itself," he began, "that this grant is wholly genuine. The seal is true. The register holds its twin. There can be no doubt whatever that the Valley of Zephyr was bound, generations past, so that it might never be sold nor pledged by any living hand." He raised his eyes, and his gaze came to rest hard upon Malachor. "Which leads this court to a question it finds most troubling, my lord." He lifted one document from the great pile. "Master Finch has drawn our notice to this. It is a paper from your own collection, a mortgage you yourself purchased upon the Zephyr Mill. And here, in its second clause, it makes plain reference to the very grant we have this day examined. The old condition is named within your own deed, in black ink. You knew of it. You have known of it the whole while." A stir passed through the chamber like wind moving over still water. "You did not gather those mortgages in ignorance," Sir Edmund pressed on, his voice growing harder with every word. "You bought them knowing full well they were worthless, and you used them to threaten a peer of this realm, to demand his estates, and to drive an innocent lady from her own home. That is no honest merchant's error. That is fraud, deliberate and cold, carried out across a span of years." Malachor rose. Whatever mildness had ever softened him was gone now, scoured clean away, and what lay beneath it was uglier than any of them had supposed. "You are all of you fools," he said, low and trembling. I have bought and sold half the men in this county. I have made fortunes and unmade them, while you slept in your beds. And you would set the whole of it aside for one scrap of moldering parchment and the tears of a crippled woman? The word dropped into the silence, like a stone into a deep well. Eleanor did not so much as flinch. She rolled her chair forward a single turn and looked up at him with not a trace of fear upon her face. That crippled woman, she said, clear and even, has just undone everything you spent 20 years building. From a chair in a single afternoon. You measured every soul you ever met by what you might take from them, my lord. It never once entered your mind to ask what they might do to guard the people they love. That was your undoing, and you fashioned every part of it with your own 2 hands. Sir Edmund struck the table with the flat of his palm, and the whole chamber fell still. This court has heard more than enough. It is the judgment of the arbitrators that every claim brought by Lord Malachor against the Duke of Oakhaven be dismissed in its entirety. The deeds are declared void, root and branch. The debts he purchased are no debts at all, and his grace owes him not so much as a single copper coin. He drew a slow breath. Further, in light of the deliberate fraud this court has laid bare, Lord Malachor is henceforth barred from trading, from holding property, and from setting foot within this province from this day onward. Let the order be entered and sealed. The gold-lit chamber broke into an uproar of voices, yet the worst of it, for Malachor, was still to come. A man who had poured a vast fortune into buying up debts, now proven worthless, had, when all was reckoned, ruined none but himself. The merchants he had cheated on his long, hard climb, the lenders he had squeezed dry, the partners he had outwitted and cast aside. Every one of them had sat and watched the proceedings, and every one of them now understood that the great Lord Malachor's empire had been raised upon nothing whatever. Before the sun had gone down, his own creditors were hammering at the doors of the obsidian citadel. The lawyer's fees he had run up in his eagerness to strip Raymond bare came due upon his own head instead. The patient trap he had spent so many years constructing closed, in the very end, upon the hand that had set it. He was led from the chamber a beggar in a fine coat, and not one person in all that crowded room stood to speak a single word on his behalf. When at last the great room had emptied of its clamor, Raymond crossed the floor to where Eleanor sat, and halted a pace short of her, as though he no longer felt he held the right to come any nearer. "You knew," he said, and his voice had lost its steadiness now, "the whole of it. The journal, why I did what I did. You knew, and still you came." "I knew from the moment I read your own hand," Eleanor answered softly. "You great, foolish, gallant man. You would have thrown away your name, your house, your very self, and let me believe to the end of my days that you had ceased to love me. Did you truly suppose I would allow such a thing?" Raymond's composure, which had held firm through his disgrace and his ruin and the loss of all he owned, gave way at the last. He could summon no words at all. He only reached out and took her hand in both of his, and bowed his head low over it, and the strength that had carried him through the darkest fortnight of his life dissolved into something that shook his shoulders and would not be quieted. Eleanor let him hold her hand and said nothing to hurry him. About them, the last of the crowd drifted out into the gathering evening, and the low gold light traveled slowly across the emptied benches. A great deal remained still to be spoken between them, words of sorrow and of pardon and of all the long days that lay ahead. But those words belonged to a gentler place than this, a quiet one, far from any court or any watching crowd. For the moment it was enough that the danger had passed, that the truth stood plainly told, and that his hand and hers were clasped together once again. 3 days after the court had spoken, when the last of the papers were signed and the last of the noise had faded away, Raymond sent word to Zephyr Valley to ask whether the Duchess would meet him at the Silverleaf Cliffs. He did not know whether she would come. He had no right to expect it. Still, he rode out to the old overlook at the close of the day and waited there, hat in hand, watching the winding road below. The Silverleaf Cliffs had been their own place since the earliest days of their marriage, a high green shoulder of land where the silver birches leaned out above the valley, and from which, far below and away to the west, the chimneys and towers of Oakhaven Manor could be seen catching the last light of the sun. They had come here often in the good years, before ever the shadow of Malachor fell across their lives. Raymond had scarcely dared to hope he might stand upon this spot with her again. The sun was sinking low and turning the whole western sky to copper and rose, when at last he heard the soft creak of wheels upon the path. Agnes brought the mahogany chair up to the crest of the rise, and then, with quiet tact, drew back down the slope to leave the two of them alone. For a while neither spoke. The evening breeze stirred the birch leaves overhead, and below, one by one, the windows of the distant manor began to glow. Raymond crossed the grass and knelt down upon the earth before her chair, so that for once he looked up into her face rather than down upon it. "I rehearsed 100 speeches on the ride here," he said, "and every one of them was too small for what I owe you. So I shall only give you the truth, plainly. I am sorry, Eleanor, not for wishing you safe. I would guard you with my last breath, and make no apology for it. I am sorry that I chose your fate for you, without you. I looked upon the danger, and thought myself the only one strong enough to carry it. I treated you as a thing to be hidden away and protected, when all the while you were the one soul clever enough and brave enough to carry us both through. I broke your heart, because I did not trust you with the truth. That was my true sin, and I shall wear the shame of it to the end of my days." Eleanor gazed at him a long moment, the proud man kneeling in the grass with the copper light upon his face, and tears standing bright in his eyes, and the last hard knot of hurt within her came quietly undone. "You are forgiven," she said. "You were forgiven before ever I turned the last page of that journal. A man who would ruin himself to shield the woman he loves is not a man I can stay angry with, however badly he blundered in the doing of it." He bowed his head, and she reached out and laid her hand along his cheek, and raised it gently until he met her eyes once more. "But hear me now, Raymond, for I shall say it only the once. I am not made of glass, and I never was. This chair has never made me weak, not for a single day of my life. Whatever storm should come to us in the years ahead, and storms will come, for they always do, you will not face it alone and name it protecting me. You will come to me. We shall meet it together, as two people who married for that very purpose. Give me that promise, and there is nothing left in all the world between us to forgive." "I promise it," Raymond said. "With the whole of my heart, I promise it." He pressed his lips to her hand and then rose to his feet, and he drew a long breath of the clean evening air, like a man breaking the surface of deep water. Below them, Oakhaven glowed warm against the gathering dusk, and it seemed to Eleanor that even from so great a distance, she could feel the life stirring back into it. "Come home," Raymond said softly. "There is something you ought to see." The word had gone out the very hour the court's ruling was known, and it had raced through the county faster than any horse could gallop. The Duchess was innocent, the Duke had been cruelly wronged, and Oakhaven belonged to them once more. By the time the carriage carried Eleanor up the long drive at the fall of night, every window of the great house blazed with candlelight, and the whole of the household stood waiting upon the steps to greet her. They were all of them there. Mr. Grayling waited at the door with his white gloves upon his hands again, and the great ring of keys restored to his belt. Mrs. Pruitt had the ovens roaring, and a feast half prepared, and she wept openly into her apron at the first sight of her mistress. Ned Carter had every horse back in its stall, and brushed to a shine. The footmen and the maids and the gardeners, every soul who had walked down that drive sooner than serve a house without her, now lined the way with lanterns lifted high, and a great cheer rose up as the carriage rolled to a halt. They carried her chair up the steps upon their shoulders, laughing all the while, and set her down in the warm, bright hall she had left behind in cold and darkness. Fires burned in every grate. The dust sheets had all been drawn away and folded, and in the corner of the great hall, the tall clock that had wound down and stopped upon the day she departed, now ticked steadily once again, for Grayling had set it going with his own hand the very hour he returned. Eleanor looked about her at the shining hall, at the beaming faces of the people who had loved her enough to give up everything for her sake, at her husband standing near with his whole heart written plain upon his face. She understood then that the house had done far more than merely come back to life. It was more truly alive than it had ever been. Raymond bent and spoke low against her ear. "The winter is nearly upon us," he said, "and on the first cold morning of it, I mean to write your name in the frost upon every window in this house, as I used to do, so that the whole world may know exactly whose home this is." Eleanor laughed, and the bright sound of it filled the hall and rose up into the old rafters, and Oakhaven Manor, which had fallen so cold and so silent when she left it, was warm again, from cellar to attic. They had lost everything and won it all back, and their bond, tempered in the fire of everything they had suffered together, was stronger now than it had ever been in all the years before. And so it stayed, through that winter and through all the many good years that came kindly after.